So the topic of Minnesota tree identification is what we're going to be focusing on this week and next week. And I think by the time you get done with this, you'll kind of have fun being able to identify some trees out in your yard, and you'll have some knowledge moving forward of what some of the basic trees are. So this slideshow is adapted from a guy named Jason Meyer from the St. Louis County Land and Minerals Department. I saw this online, thought it was useful, and I wanted to be able to add some of my own stuff to it. So I Googled him and called him, and he sent it to me yesterday. We had a good conversation. So he's located in Minnesota, obviously, and knows a lot about this. So some of this is his, and some of this is stuff that I added in for your information. So first of all, what is a tree? A tree is a woody plant that usually has a single upright stem, and it grows to a height of at least 15 feet. There are some things that we call trees that are a little bit shorter than that, but that's a general definition. In contrast, shrubs usually have several upright or spreading stems that branch from the base, and they grow less than 15 feet tall, usually. Okay, so that's just kind of a basic definition of a tree. When we start identifying trees, we need to start with the big picture, first of all. So know what you can expect to find in the area you are working. If we're looking at a natural system, which is like out in your grove or out in your yard, for the most part, the things that have just kind of grown there. These are forest or trees which were established naturally or managed by an entity striving to maintain natural forest systems. Okay, these are mostly public parks or natural areas, natural forested lands. I shouldn't have said your yard. I'm talking more about most people's groves have kind of naturally developed over time. Artificial or human impacted systems are forest or trees that have been established artificially or managed by somebody who is trying to maintain a space, but they're not necessarily worried about keeping it natural or keeping native species there. So private yards, some windbreaks or shelter breaks, like my parents planted, a row of honeysuckles. Um, those that would be an example of an artificial or human impacted system. Okay, so first of all, kind of know what you're looking at because sometimes we find trees in places where we wouldn't expect them. This first picture over here is an acacia tree found on the African plains. You wouldn't expect to find this in Minnesota, but you might see this. The oak savanna habitat in south central Minnesota uh, has bur oaks in it, so we'd expect to see that. So you kind of know what plants you'd expect to see in certain places just based on what grows there. Okay, these are Minnesota's forest regions. Um, we live in the prairie region. We naturally see cottonwoods, eastern red cedars, and bur oaks in this area. Obviously, there's a lot of other species that have been introduced. The center of the state, the red area, is mainly deciduous forest. They call this the hardwood region, where we see a lot of oaks, maple trees, green ash, white ash, those types of things. And the northern boreal forest, we see a lot of the spruce, firs, pines. These are more of the coniferous forests. So when we talk about tree ID, I'm going to touch on deciduous tree ID, things like maples and ash trees and some of those, but we're really going to focus our tree ID on coniferous trees. Part of the reason for that is that this time of year, a lot of the trees are just budding out, and so it's a little bit easier to work with conifers because the needles or leaves stay on all year round. So I think you'll have the skills that you need by the end of this to take a key and be able to go out and figure out any kind of tree in your yard. But we're going to focus on coniferous trees for this class. And Bob Rustler, who happens to be my neighbor, but he works with our forestry team for FFA, he's going to teach you through a video lesson about some of the common trees that you'll see around here. Okay, so after you kind of figure out what is native to an area or what should be growing there, the second step is to determine if your tree is coniferous or deciduous. A coniferous tree bears its seeds in cones and have narrow needle-like leaves for the most part. We'll talk about that in a little bit. They are evergreen, meaning they maintain their leaves throughout the year, except for a tree called the tamarack. Okay, so when we think of things like firs and spruces and pines, those are coniferous trees, the evergreen trees. Deciduous trees do not bear their seeds in cones. Okay, they are an angiosperm, they're a fruiting plant. You know, like the little whirligigs that you see come off from trees, or we worked with the Kentucky coffee tree that had the almost like the banana pod with the really thick seeds, and we did that lab with scarification. Those are deciduous trees, right? Those are fruiting structures that come from those trees. So they don't have cones and they have broad leaves that drop in the fall. Okay, so they don't maintain their leaves throughout the year. Okay, so I uploaded a book called Minnesota Trees. It's from the University of Minnesota Extension Service, and it was written in like 1995, but it's fantastic as far as a really simple guide to trees that you expect to see in Minnesota. So the whole book is there, and a lot of these pictures that I'm going to show you on upcoming slides came from that book. Okay, so if you wanted to print it, you could. You don't need to do that. There's a couple pages that are really useful, and I'll point those out as we go through here. So first of all, trees can be divided, like I said, into two groups, deciduous and coniferous. So you can see examples on the left of deciduous trees. Those are broadleafs, right? They're flat and bigger. On the right, you see some different examples of coniferous trees. We call these leaves, even though they're more needle-like. But if you hear me talk about leaves, that is the correct term there too. Okay, we're going to use the dichotomous key from the book that I posted. It's a PDF version, but this is an example of what the key would look like. Dichotomous means two. You have two choices in each step. So you're going to see here we have choice 1A or we have choice 1B. So the seeds are born in a woody cone. Leaves are needle-like or overlapping, like fish scales, and they're persistent in the winter, meaning they stay through the winter. Or your other option is 1B. Seeds are not born in cones. The leaves are broad and flat and absent in winter. This is the first step. This is the first step of the key. Are we talking about a conifer or are we talking about a deciduous tree? Okay, so this kind of gives you the first clue to split into those two categories. If we were talking about a a coniferous tree, if this is true, 1A is true, then we'd go down to 2A. Okay, are the leaves brownish green, less than 2 inches long, or are the leaves bluish green, 2 inches long or greater? Okay, so you'd have to pick between 2A and 2B. Let's say that 2B is correct. The leaves are bluish green, they're 2 inches long or greater. Then I would go down to 4B, or 4A and 4B. Are the cones less than 8 inches long, or are the cones 8 to 12 inches long? Let's say that 4B is correct. If 4B is the correct identifying factor, I have a blue pine. Okay, so that's the way that you're going to use the dichotomous key that I show you in a little bit. Okay, in this book, there are some excellent drawings of some of the different characteristics. Okay, so we talked about leaf arrangement earlier in this class, alternate, opposite, or world. We talked about simple versus compound leaves. We talked about leaf margins. All of these things matter when you're identifying trees. So you might have wondered why we spent time on that earlier in the class. But those are the characteristics that a taxonomist would look at to help identify a tree. Okay, so I included this in here just because I wanted you to see some of the things. If you are using the deciduous tree key from this book, these are some of the things that you'd be looking at to help you identify the trees. We are focusing on coniferous trees. Okay, so here's the page from the book that focuses on that. But these are the characteristics that are most important. So first of all, you have to determine the shape of the leaves. Okay, so are the leaves from the coniferous tree needle-like? And you can see some examples over here of needle-like leaves. Are they linear shaped, awl-shaped, or scale-like? Okay, so that's your first thing. You have to determine the shape of the leaves. Second would be to measure them. Get a ruler out. How long is the leaf? And then the last part is kind of the arrangement. Are they in bundles or clusters? Or are they held together in tufts of 12 or more? Are they in bundles of 2 to 5? Those are the kinds of things that Bob is going to go through with you to help you identify the leaves that you're encountering. Okay, so first thing you look at shape. Second, you think about how they're arranged. Are they in bundles, clusters? How are they put together? Next, you would look at the cones. You would note the location and position of the cones on the tree. You'd get your ruler back out and measure the length of the cone and maybe examine the cone scales. This cone over here, these needles and that structure kind of reminds me of like a chicken foot, and so you're going to kind of look at characteristics of all the different parts of the tree. Okay, the last thing you would look at is the color and texture of the twigs and bark. So there's a lot of different characteristics, but just know that this is a page in that PDF copy that I uploaded to Google Classroom of the Minnesota Tree Book. So if you ever get confused, you can come back to this and take a look at it. Okay, so here's our key, one of our keys to coniferous trees. This comes from page 14 of that book that I uploaded. Okay, so you're going to start with 1A and 1B. Leaves are scale-like or awl-shaped, or leaves are linear-shaped or needle-like. So you would go back to that picture I just shared with you. Are they, I have to look at this again, scale-like or awl-shaped? Okay, so does it fit into this category, or is it linear or needle-like? Okay, let's say that it is linear shaped or needle-like. Okay, mine are needles. Okay, so I'm going to go down here from 1B. I'm going to drop down to 3A and 3B. Remember, it's a dichotomous key, so there's two choices. Are the leaves borne in clusters or bundles of 2 or more, or are they borne singly? So maybe there's one needle that sticks out. If that's the case, you'd drop down here and continue on with 5A and 5B. Are the leaves needle-like, four-sided, and stiff, or are they linear-shaped, flattened, soft, and relatively flexible? Mine are needle-like, four-sided, and stiff. So at this point, I've identified that I have a spruce. Okay, so I know that then I'm in the spruce category, and I'd want to go to page 14 and 15 of that book to see if I can figure out which spruce I'm dealing with. Okay, so that's one way to use the dichotomous key. Bob's going to go through a whole bunch of characteristics of different trees, and you're going to start to be able to tell without going through this whole key what some of the trees are that you're looking at. I like this version a little bit better. This is found on page 97 of the Minnesota Tree Book that I shared with you because it's got pictures. So let's start with, if it's a coniferous tree, are the leaves needle-like or linear shaped, or are they scale-like or awl-shaped? You notice this is the same thing as the previous slide that I just showed you, but it's in a different form. It's like a flow chart and pictures. Okay, so let's say that, yep, my leaves look like this. Okay, they're needle-like, and there's a couple of them there. So I'm going to follow this path down. And yep, mine are bundled leaves. There's 2 to 5 needles per group. So now we've got pines. So yep, I'm looking at the pines. Okay, so I've narrowed down from all conifers to just the pine trees just by following through this little flow chart. There's a similar one on pages 98 to 99 of deciduous. This is about deciduous trees. I think deciduous trees can be a little bit more complicated just because you have to know if the leaf is simple or compound, and you have to make a lot of judgment calls about like the margin of the leaf. But I'm going to offer this as an extra credit opportunity in week 2. If you want to try to key out a couple leaves from trees in your yard of deciduous trees, that'll be an opportunity for you to gain a little extra credit. So look for that in weeks to come. So I'm going to put this whole slideshow online just as a reference for you. I'm not going through all of the rest of this slideshow, but I just want you to know there's some really good information in here about all the different tree species and what each part of the tree looks like. So that resource is there for coniferous trees if you want it. It also has this slide, and I'm going to get cut off here in a little bit, but it tells you if something's scale-like, you're maybe looking at a cedar. If it's needle-like, and it gives you a quick summary of what kind of pine or spruce, tamarack, or fir you're probably looking at. These are some of the most common trees. So Once again, I'm going to upload this just as a resource because then you have all